Chapter 9, Adult Lifestyles. So we're going to cover a lot of different things in this chapter, including the diversity of adult lifestyles, how they affect people's lives. We're going to discuss the family life cycle, discuss parenting, how it affects children's adjustment. We're going to cover a lot of different lifestyles, including singles, living with somebody, that impact, married, divorced, remarried adults, diverse relationships. So let's go ahead and get started. Single adults. So the percentage of single adults who live alone has increased from 8% in the 70s to about 25% in 2000, and it continues. I mean, this data is quite old now, and it continues to grow. Part of the reason for that is that it is now socially acceptable to be a single adult. Back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, of course, it was not as acceptable, but nowadays it is. So we do see a rise in that. Although some people do choose to be single, there are some problems. Some of the problems that might be there and might result in living alone could be difficulty forming intimate relationships with adults. There could be, if you live alone, you could be lonely. And there could be difficulty finding a niche in society where, that is marriage oriented. So of course when you're in your 20s, it's really not a big deal not to be married, but as time goes on, 30s, 40s, and your friends start getting married, it does get a little bit tricky, because your friends start pairing off and start doing couples related things. It's certainly not impossible, and you can find that niche, but it does change things. But there are advantages to living alone. You get to make your own decisions about where you want to be in life. You get time to develop your personal resources, to meet your own goals. You have freedom to make your decisions, freedom to pursue your own schedule, opportunities to explore new places and new things. There's lots of people who choose to live alone. So let's say that you're not ready to get married, but you do want to live with somebody. You can cohabitate. And that is living together in a sexual relationship without being married. So the percentage of couples who cohabitate before marriage has also increased. And that has gone from 11% to 60% in 2000. Again, this data is very old, and it continues to rise. Again, that has a lot to do with what society considers as acceptable. So we have a large percentage of from late teens the whole way up into 30s of people who are, and older, but people who are cohabitating. So we'll go on to being married. Majority of people, majority, and this number, although old, still remains, majority of people have been married at least once. About 60% of adults are married, so as far as our adults, the majority of adults are currently married. The reason there's a difference there is we do have a large portion of people who were once married and divorced. The average age for women is around 25, for men 27, which is older than it was several decades ago. And we still find about 25%, about 50% of marriages ending in divorce, and that is for first-time marriages. Second-time marriages, so for example, if you're on your second marriage, that statistic is actually higher. So if you're being married for the second time, if you've been divorced and now you're remarrying, that number is actually higher. There's some traits that predict divorce. So these would be individual traits. These would be things that if either you or your spouse possess that correlate with divorce. So it doesn't mean necessarily it will happen, but there's a high correlation. So if there's neurotic traits, anxiety, depression, impulsiveness, self-consciousness, vulnerability to stress, anger, hostility, dysfunctional beliefs, these types of traits. So it would be good, if prior to marriage, if you notice these things, to go into the marriage being aware that this does predict a higher chance of divorce, and then making a decision, is this something, that I want to go into or not. having that awareness and certainly, making an educated decision. Now, I know a lot of people don't do that. A lot of people go, well, I love this person and we're going to work through it. But knowing that at least 50% of people get divorced, and these types of traits are correlated with divorce, if you don't work on them, if you don't acknowledge them, if you don't come up with a plan, this would put you at that higher risk. Okay, so we just talked about individual traits that predict divorce. Now here's some couple traits. Dissimilarity. In other words, if you have two people and they're dissimilar, because if you remember last chapter, we talked about how birds of a feather flock together. We talked about how it's important that the couple has similarities. Well, if you're dissimilar on the important things, for example, if one partner is highly religious and the other one is not, if one partner is really strong, has strong beliefs about family and the other one doesn't, if one partner really wants to have children and the other one doesn't, I'm talking about the big things. So if there's dissimilarity, that predicts divorce. Short acquaintanceship. In other words, you met the person, you got married right away. Premarital sex, especially with a lot of different partners. Premarital pregnancy. Cohabitation. Poor communication and conflict resolution skills. Now, again, it does not mean that if one of these things happen, that means that you're going to get divorced. It just means that these things are linked with a higher likelihood. So, what you can do is you can buffer against it. You can be aware of it and then, take steps to prevent. There's also some contextual things that predict divorce. For example, being of a younger age. I'm talking, late teens, early 20s, unhealthy family of origin experiences. So if you have people that grew up with, not having good role models as to how a successful marriage will work, if their parents divorced or they had chronic marriage conflicts, again, not having that positive role model, if the parents or the friends disapprove of the marriage, if there was a lot of pressure to get married in the first place, or if there was little education or career preparation. And that has to do with a couple of things, but one of them being financial, because that can place a lot of stress. So if you don't have a lot of education and you don't have a career, then that assumes that you would be struggling financially. So we just talked about what predicts divorce, but let's talk about what predicts having a happy marriage. Well, the individual traits, the person would have high self-esteem, they would be flexible, they would be assertive. Remember we talked about the difference between being assertive and aggressive? I believe that was the last chapter. And they're sociable. So these are some individual traits. As far as being a couple, the couple is similar. So again, on the important topics, they're similar. It doesn't mean that they have to have everything the same, but they're similar on the important things. They knew each other for a long time. They have good communication skills, and they have good conflict resolution skills and a style. So in other words, when conflict arises, they're able to resolve it instead of escalating it. As far as the contextual, they tend to be older. They have happy family of origin experiences, or have resolved if they did not have a happy family of origin. They had their parents had a happy marriage. They have their parent and friends' approval, and they have significant education and career preparation. So they have a sense of a career, they have a sense of who they are. So that stuff is all taken care of, and now they're ready to dedicate themselves to their marriage. So I listed some things that you could do with your partner. These aren't graded, these are just things that you could do. So one thing you could do is list your partner's 5 most important life goals. Don't ask them, don't ask what they are. I want you just to think, what are my partner's 5 most important life goals? And see if you know them. And then discuss how well you know your partner with others. How does your experience compare with theirs? And take a look at how familiar you are with your partner's current life stressors. In other words, do you know what is stressing out your partner? What things are bothering them now? What things are stressing them out? Do you know? And things like this, that kind of intimacy, it it's important to have that awareness and to be connected like that. One of the problems, well, I'll say problems that we have here in the United States is that we have a lot of marital expectations and myths. So I think here in the States we kind of go into marriage with this myth that everything's going to work out and love will conquer all and it's going to be this fairy tale. And marriage therapists believe that it's really important to have realistic expectations about marriage and to understand that it's not going to be this fairy tale, happy, Cinderella sort of story. And I think some of that we get from, we watch these movies where, everything's against them and then all of a sudden they live happily ever after. And they don't work at it and they don't have to do anything to make things better. So it's important to have realistic expectations, realistic understandings of what all goes into a marriage. And, it doesn't just work out, you have to actively work at it. So here are some of the myths. One myth is that affairs are the main reason why people get divorced. And actually an affair is not one of the main reasons people get divorced. People have affairs and they don't necessarily get divorced. I've had lots of couples come in for therapy and people decide to stay together or not. But the marriage has, if they do get divorced, the marriage has crumbled long before. Or if they have an affair and they decide to stay together, then the marriage is worth salvaging. The idea that men are not biologically made for marriage, basically what that's saying is I'm going to accept my spouse, my husband's cheating. And this idea that men are from Mars and women are from Venus, men and women are different. There are some differences in communication styles, but the idea that we're so different that, we just can't communicate, I would argue against that. I find that we can communicate. There are some differences, but communication certainly is possible. So, some adjustment strategies. Establish love maps. And I gave you an example of one of those in Chapter 8. So if you go to the learning module for Chapter 8, I posted one of those. Nurture fondness and admiration. And I have here a 5-to-1 ratio. So in other words, you should be saying 5 nice, kind things for every 1 not so nice thing. And that's a minimum. Turn toward each other instead of away. So when things are rough, when things are, difficult, you should be turning inward instead of outward. Let your partner influence you. Solve the conflicts. Overcome gridlock. Sometimes it's more important to just say, you know what, it's okay. I'll let you have your way. It's not worth fighting over this. And create shared meaning. In other words, have shared experiences, have shared memories together. Do things. One of the homework assignments I sometimes give couples is every day they are to do one nice thing for their partner without their partner knowing about it. So every day they're to find something, whether it is, just to clean up around, maybe their partner left their dirty laundry out, just to clean it up and not say anything. Or to pack their lunch when they normally wouldn't. To find one thing that day that they wouldn't normally do, but that would help their partner. And not say anything about it, not mention it, not just do that every day. And do it just out of pure, I want to do something for you. And what ends up happening is the partner starts to feel appreciated, like, wow, look, my wife or my husband's doing this for me. And the person who's doing it, if you do it out of a sense of, I really want to do something for you, you start to feel good about it too. So, some conflict areas. We have conflict from work, stress, in-laws, money, sex, housework, new baby, any sort of major life change, um, you know, can cause conflict. So, best way to deal with conflict? Well, suggestion would be to start out with a soft approach instead of starting out, at 100-mile-an-hour screaming, arguing. Start with a soft approach. Always be motivated to repair the relationship. The goal is to stay together. Regulate your emotions, compromise, and be tolerant of each other's faults. So your book then goes into some things about divorce. I'm going to skip that right now. But be sure you read about it. It talks about the timing of divorce. It talks about stresses from divorce, coping with divorce. So be sure that you read over those. Okay, so I'm skipping to life cycle, so make sure that you've read in between there. So the family life cycle has 6 basic stages. So as a young adult, you leave home. Then you have the new couple, so joining family through marriage. Becoming a family with children, a family with adolescents, midlife family, and then families later in life. So, leaving home. Launching is the process in which the youth moves into adulthood and exits their family of origin. You'll hear a lot about that now because we have a lot of young adults who launch, or you hear this failure to launch. So they'll launch and then come back and then launch again. A lot to do with our economy, but launching the process in which they leave the family of origin. Second stage is forming a new couple. The union of two individuals from separate families. And there I am in 1992 in a youth hostel, and I meet my future husband. We met there. He's from South Africa, and I am obviously from the United States, and we met there one day, and well, there we are. Swing forward, I don't know, 14, 16 years, and we have becoming a family with children. The third stage, parents become caregivers to a younger generation. Adds lots of strain, stress to the kids. It's a whole new dimension. So we have a separate stage now, family with children. Families with adolescents. Adolescence is a period in which the teens start pushing for autonomy. They seek to develop their own identity. I think there's a myth that there's, tons of conflict between the adolescent and their parent. That's really an older model. Now we realize that most of the conflict between the teen and the parent is about sort of minor issues. So, for example, teens will fight about what clothing they're going to wear, about cleaning up their room, things like that. But as far as the main issues, most teens follow their parents and they have similar views on political things, on religious things, on the important issues. So we now think that the parents do have a really important role and that the conflict isn't as bad as we used to say. Of course there are exceptions, but in general most teens and parents do get along. There are sparks of issues, but again, that tends to be on sort of minor things as opposed to huge philosophical issues or philosophical differences. Your book, by the way, has some adjustment strategies for living with teens. So certainly if you have a teenager in your house, make sure you read over them. That there's some suggestions on how to better parent teenagers. I'm going to skip then to families in midlife. Fifth stage, the time of launching the children. So now you are the one launching your children, adapting to midlife changes. It is there is the empty nest syndrome, but most people do not experience the empty nest syndrome. And when I say empty nest syndrome, to have that, there has to be a huge feeling of emptiness. Most parents, they have a sense of, loss and some sadness, their children have moved out, but they don't go through this whole syndrome. So most adapt fairly well. Most parents experience an increase in marital satisfaction after their children have left home. And here we have, if kids do come back home, the parents and the children have to make adjustments because obviously the first time the children were living at home, they were children, and now they're returning as adults. So we could talk about this, it's an entire lecture of the impact of adult children moving back home. And the sixth stage is the family later in life. Retirement, grandparenting, that would be this stage. So, when's the best time to have children? Should you have your children in your 20s, 30s, 40s? Because, people are having children now in their 40s. Well, some advantages to having kids in your 20s. You certainly have more physical energy. The mother is less likely to have problems with her pregnancy and childbirth. And parents are less likely to build up expectations for their children. There are also some advantages to having children in your 30s, which is what I did. You have more time to consider your goals in life. You tend to be more mature. I was exhausted, so I think, actually that wouldn't be an advantage. That'd be a disadvantage. Sorry about that. You're able to benefit from your experiences, and you're more established in your career. You have more income, so some advantages there to each age. Going to move right into Diana Baumrind and 4 parenting styles. This is really big, and it's one of the concepts that you should leave the class knowing. You're going to hear Baumrind. You probably were introduced if you have Gen Psych. I know that we've talked about it in my life cycle in my child development class. But basically what Diana Baumrind did was she came up with 4 different styles of parenting: authoritarian, authoritative, neglectful, and indulgent. So what I want you to do is think about which of these styles your parents used on you. And the relevance of this is depending on what style a person grew up with, we see links between that and how their current relationships, how they handle their relationships now. So the authoritarian, that is my way or the highway. And the way I remember that, authoritarian, it's a made-up word, but I think of dictarian, completely made-up word, but I think of like a dictator, dictarian, authoritarian. And like a dictator is somebody like it's my way or the highway. And that's what authoritarian is. It's my way, the highway. I tell you what to do. I don't want any back talk from you. You do what I say or else there's a consequence. And there is no discussion about it. Authoritative. These are parents who are loving, nurturing. They have firm boundaries and firm expectations, but they do so in a loving, nurturing sort of way. Neglectful parents are parents who the child pretty much can do what they want. The child is really out on their own. There's not firm boundaries. There's not firm rules or expectations. And you can just imagine that these children grow up to become adults that have problems with impulse control. They have problems with following rules, expectations. And then we have indulgent parents, and these parents also don't have firm expectations or firm boundaries. So the children, they don't really have rules, but then the parents are just hovering over them and giving them what they want. You can think about like a spoiled child that doesn't really have any rules, but the parents are just hovering over them. And they don't have a good sense of self-control. They think they can, pretty much everything they want they have. And you can just imagine how that would translate into an adult and how difficult it would be to have a relationship with somebody like that. A question I usually get asked is, what if I have to work? I can't stay home with my kids. What if I have to work? And the research really, it's not clear. We haven't really found any detrimental effects of maternal employment if the child care is quality. So if you're able to find quality child care, then we're not finding detrimental effects. If the quality of the child care is subpar, if it's not, really good child care, then we find negative impact. Ideally, the first year of life, it's, if the child can have a single caregiver, that's better. If the child needs to be in daycare, one that has a small ratio would be ideal. The times when it's better for the mom to work is if the mom wants to work. We do see that, let's say the mom really likes to work and does not want to be a stay-at-home mom, and that happens. There are women who do not want to be at home. And I'll tell you, I was one of them. I stayed at home with my kids, but I needed to be out sometimes. So actually that's when I started teaching at Hack. I needed to get out, so I started teaching, I think it was like 6 hours a week, because I needed to talk to adults. So if I didn't have that outlet, I think I would have gone batty. So there are some people that just need to get out of the house and need to, be not a stay-at-home mom. And if that is the case, then, some babies are better off, or some toddlers are better off, in a childcare situation if the mom is really unhappy at home. Speaking of children, let's talk about children from divorced families. Children from divorced families do have poor adjustment. If you're from divorced families, we see about a 25% chance of having antisocial behaviors, and that would be pregnancy, dropping out, alcohol, drug problems, parent conflict. But then 10% of children from intact families show these behaviors. So we have, 25 versus 10. So there is an increase with divorced children from divorced families, but then we still see it with, children that were with intact families. A lot of it has to do with, by the way, how the divorce proceeded. So for example, if you have a child coming from a divorced family, but the family or the parents worked together, they, really did a lot to minimize the impact on the children, the chances are the kids are going to fare pretty well. If you have a divorce going through and it is just an ugly, nasty divorce, that places the kids at risk. But then the other factor is the personality of the children. Some children are very resilient, and all kinds of things can happen and they will still be okay. Other kids, even if everything is done right, and I say right like in parentheses or in quotation marks, because I don't even know what right is. I mean, we don't know exactly right. But even if everything's done to the best of your ability, they're still going to have adjustment problems. So a lot of it's the personality of the child, and then how everything's handled, and the circumstances, the situation. You throw all that together, and then we have, an increase of children having issues from divorced families. Here are some strategies for communicating. Explain the separation in a sensitive way. Explain that the separation was not the child's fault, and do that over and over and over. Explain that it may take time to feel better. It does. It does not happen overnight. They estimate that it will take between 2 and 4 years for the child and the parent to adjust. Keep the door open for further discussion. Even if it's difficult for the parent, the child may need to talk about this again. provide as much continuity as possible. So if the child is involved in, Boy Scouts, then try to keep them involved in Boy Scouts and provide support for your children. So if they need additional support, try to get that for them, whether that be a guidance counselor at school or, a therapist, or talking to somebody. Maybe they have, a special relationship with a grandmother, or, whatever. Just try to provide that as much as possible. And this chapter wraps up with child abuse. 4 basic types of child maltreatment. Maltreatment is the term that we use. So you can say maltreatment, abuse means the same thing. There's physical abuse, child neglect, sexual abuse, and emotional abuse. Physical would be the infliction of physical injury, and it does not need to be intentional. The parent does not need to intend to injure the child. Child neglect is a failure to provide for the child's basic needs, and that can include truancy. So if the parent does not provide an education for the child, that constitutes neglect. Sexual abuse is sexual contact with the child, and it does not need to be touching. It can be exposure to pornography. It's a whole realm of how sexual abuse can occur. And then emotional abuse, anything that could cause behavioral, cognitive, or emotional problems. Some of the cultural contexts: about 1/3 of parents who were abused as children grow up to abuse. So not all people who were abused grow up to abuse. And I know I've talked to a lot of people in therapy who were abused, and their greatest fear is that they will abuse once they have children. And the majority of people don't. The majority of people who were abused do not grow up to abuse, but we do have 1/3 that do. The majority of perpetrators, as far as sexual perpetrators, were abused. But the majority of children who were abused do not grow up to perpetrate. So if that makes sense, if somebody is sexually abusing, they probably were sexually abused. But the majority of people who were abused do not grow up to become abusers or perpetrators. Some of the consequences of abuse include emotional problems controlling your emotions, attachment issues, peer relations, problems maintaining friends, making friends, problems in school, psychological problems. And we come to the end of the chapter. So let me know if you have any questions. I did skip a few things in this chapter just for time, because we have again gone over the 30 minutes. Please let me know if you have questions. You can call me, text me, email me, and I am here. Thanks a lot.